You're listening to Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Two fans, two generations, all things Star Wars begins now.
All right, well, everybody, I'm Eric Vansel.
And I'm Daryl Sanders.
And we're your hosts for this show. And of course, unforeseen circumstances, we're on a little bit later. Hopefully, you guys have stuck around. Those of you who thought we were actually going to be on at 8, so did we. Didn't happen, but here we are. And of course, if you're like a lot of people and you end up watching the rebroadcast, it probably doesn't matter. So you could just disregard this whole little intro that I just did. So the interesting thing about tonight is I remember you ended up coming up. You were the one that came up with this one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And your whole premise for tonight's show, you wanted to discuss basically what set Star Wars storytelling apart from other franchises. That was like a big one. And then, of course, what do they have to do to get on track? And then there was all kinds of other little discussions that can spawn off of that. So I think by way of intro, what prompted this? Because you didn't read anything that sparked this, right? You just came up with this.
Yeah, well, it's kind of based off of some discussions I've had with people. And ironically, kind of prior to the show earlier today, I had a conversation with one of our frequent attendees, David.
Who's here. He says, hello, gentlemen, it's Star Wars Day. So he's been waiting.
Yeah, I know, right?
And so, Ted's here too. So just
hey, Ted, what's going on? Yeah, he and I kind of talked about it briefly about storytelling. He was trying to understand, why we chose this as a topic, and which led into a minor discussion about it. But it's one of those things where a lot of people, especially those who are new to Star Wars, right, who are new to the franchise, may not understand, why we are so beholden to it. First and foremost, that we came up with a whole podcast for it, but the love that that a lot of fans have for Star Wars, and why we're either so angry about the direction of Star Wars and why it's going down the path that it's going down. And they're like, okay, well, I just don't get it. You could kind of explain some of the things of Star Wars, but understanding like that Star Wars in and of itself is in a very unique lane. We often say that Star Wars is kind of in the league of its own. And it's not just because we're just super fans. We just want to, glorify the super thing, but it's true. It actually does have its own kind of niche, if you will, compared to typical science fiction, because we often say it's science fantasy, which you don't see a whole lot of.
Yeah, that's true. They don't.
Horror.
Yeah.
You have science fiction, like Aliens will fall under science horror, like the franchise Aliens.
Yeah, the sci-fi horror. There's like
yeah.
There's actually a name for the genre, actually. I'm trying to remember what it is now. But, I mean, essentially that's it. But, I mean, I think another thing that has to be clarified before we go any further with this is that one of the main things that makes Star Wars so unique is that when George Lucas just set out to write this thing, and again, the whole reason why he came up with this is because he couldn't get the rights to Flash Gordon, which is really what he wanted to do. So he wanted to come up with his own like serialized space opera, if you will, in the style of Flash Gordon. But what he did wisely, which I think goes into the timelessness of it, is that he drew from a lot of classic storytelling, and he took from other various influences and things like that, and he combined them to make something very, very unique. And I think that's why, I think if you really want to go to the crux of it, and again, if you really want to delve into this a little bit further, because we're going to go in a little bit of a different direction, but we did cover this in our whole What is Star Wars series. The first episode of that actually was the What is Star Wars. We went deep into Lucas's influences, what he brought in to create it. I mean, we really went pretty in depth. So we're not going to, I mean, most people that are watching this show pretty much know this stuff. I mean, granted, there are, like you pointed out, there's some newer Star Wars fans, but really what it comes down to is us talking about what sets us apart from different franchises. Because if you think about it, there are a lot of different franchises, either in the sci-fi and or fantasy realm, action, things like that, that are beloved, that have stood the test of time. But for some reason, Star Wars has a fan base that's a little bit more rabid than that. It's a little bit more widespread than that. Of course, Disney has done its best to kill that. It's certainly not as beloved as it once was,
Hmm.
but it has had a cultural impact that very few other franchises have, even to the point where you go to other countries and people are, they're just as nuts about it as we are. So that's really what it comes down to. That's what we're trying to go into today.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the things that and what makes the storytelling with Star Wars kind of unique from other different franchises is one, this is something that David and I were kind of discussing a little bit earlier, but is the genre. Number one, you kind of have to start there. Is that it's not science fiction, and that's kind of the overarching umbrella that I guess most people will put things in, understandably so, right? However, there's subgenres in most genres, right? So even if you had action, every action movie isn't the same. You have a mob or a gangster movie is going to be different than a superhero film that both have action in it, but they're two completely different styles of storytelling. You wouldn't compare Martin Scorsese or something like that to, you know, uh, Fast and Furious film. I mean, they just don't
Well,
go
and
together.
I think a lot of the subgenres there, right? You had the buddy cop type genre.
Hmm.
You basically have like the heist type thing. So that
Yep.
your Ocean's 11 and Italian Job and all
Yep.
that stuff would fit that. I mean, there are different subgenres of, well, pretty much everything. But
Yeah.
I think a big part of it too, and this is why I think the sci-fi thing gets tagged with Star Wars a lot. I mean, besides the fact that it does take place in space
Hmm.
and everything else, the other juggernaut, of course, is Star Trek. And there you go. There's our Star
Yep.
Trek reference for tonight. So,
Hmm.
and you basically, being that they were, I mean, obviously, Star Trek came out like 10 years earlier on television, but then theatrically, the creators of Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry and all that, were they were motivated to bring Star Trek to the big screen because of the success of Star Wars. And then, of course, you had Battlestar Galactica, which premiered on
Hmm.
television. Same thing. Then you had
Yep.
movies like The Last Starfighter and everything else. But I think that what's really interesting about this is the fact that even though around the same time period, you actually had a lot of Star Wars copycat movies coming out, they never really captured quite the same vibe
That's it.
as
Yeah.
Star Wars. Like they just, you know, they either felt cheesier or the storytelling wasn't quite as good. It was, I don't know, it was almost like magic in a bottle.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where I feel like, so even let's go into the sci-fi realm, right? And you just named, a bunch like Battlestar Galactica, yeah, but yeah, Battlestar Galactica. You named some others, but you can include like Terminator would be technically science fiction. You have
Yeah.
um and the difference, what makes science fiction different from science fantasy, which Star Wars resides, is science fiction is more rooted in the science of it all, as opposed to, and even though it's fictitious, it's more rooted in science, right? So when you brought up Star Trek, of course, which most people will try to compare Star Wars to. However, if you look at the technology and things that they had in Star Trek, like, he's like on screen and they're having like a video conference, with someone across the galaxy on this giant screen. Well, that's nothing but FaceTime now. But in the 60s, like that was like, ooh, same thing when we were little kids with our bowl of cereal on Saturday morning watching the Jetsons or something. Like a lot of the technology and things like that, they were actually legitimately working on. I mean, granted, it has taken up until this point for it to happen, but
Well,
look,
there's a big
we
thing
can see
though,
that.
but I mean, actually, a lot of the technology. Well, depending on who you ask, there are some that think that when we found spaceships at Roswell or something that we reverse engineered it, and that's why technology got this huge leap, right? But one of
Hmm.
the things that a lot of these people who have created a lot of this stuff, they were influenced by Star Trek. They grew up watching Star Trek.
Yeah,
And so
absolutely,
therefore they're like,
absolutely,
"Hey, we want to make this thing for real," you know?
100%. Yeah, and that's the thing, and um, there's even like when you talk about warp drives and all that, like there's mathematical things. Like they're actually talking about real things about bending time and like speed times mass. Like they're actually doing some way far out like math that I definitely would fail. But you know, these things are actually predicated and based on real things where Star Wars doesn't fall into that category. It's fantasy. It's more mystical. It's more of like I said, it's Harry Potter in space, just set in a space background. It's that's basically what happened. You have Harry Potter and space had a baby, and now you have Star Wars.
Yeah, or like King
Um,
Arthur's Court or something like that. I mean, it's
yep.
interesting to me that Lucas started out wanting to make the Flash Gordon series, which was basically like a sci-fi serial pretty much.
Hmm.
And yet, because he brought in these other influences and because he had this other timeless story, it's weird that he didn't just make his own version of Flash Gordon. I mean, I guess you can argue that in some ways he did, but Flash Gordon is definitely more in the sci-fi realm than
Yeah.
say Star Wars, right? Because like you said, I
Mhm.
mean it was science fiction, there is more of emphasis on the whole science part of it like you said, the technology. They have to root it a little bit more in the sense that you have to explain how things work. By the way, Ronaldo joined
Mhm.
us. What's up, Ronaldo?
Hey.
Um, so you have to give the why to the what
Yeah.
in sci-fi.
Absolutely.
Whereas in fantasy, you don't. You know, you it's pretty much everything's magical. And so in Star Wars, you pretty much have elements of both. I mean, we know how a lightsaber works. You know, we know
Right.
how the ships basically work. There is that explanation to the point where they even came out with the encyclopedias with schematics
Cross
and
sections and
yeah,
you're right.
exactly. You know, and explanations on how everything worked and it was pretty fascinating, but then of course you have the fantasy element to it. And I agree. I think that fantasy tends to be more timeless than sci-fi.
Mhm.
You know, it's funny because if you just go and you look at the Star Trek series over the years from the original series on, and you can tell, and a lot of times people would point to it and say, "Well, yeah, because you can look at what time period it was made and everything." But the other thing that you can look at besides the production value is just some of the themes that they deal with. Because in a
Yeah.
lot of cases with sci-fi, they'll do that. They'll bring in themes. You mentioned the Terminator. The Terminator was more of a dystopian type of a thing. But
Mhm.
obviously, you know, there was the fear of nuclear war and all that back in 84. So a lot of that crept in. And then, of course,
Mhm.
the idea that,
AI.
yeah, I mean, you know, we're kind of marching toward that
Yep.
now. You're wondering,
Mhm.
okay, who's the Miles Dyson that's going to be, that's going to create Skynet? You know, I always
Skynet.
used to joke that Skynet isn't going to be some supercomputer. It's going to be like your refrigerator or your Alexa or your toaster or something. You know, it's
It's gonna
going
be
to
Siri.
you know, your phone becomes self-aware and enslaves all of mankind. But the point is that you definitely have a lot of these wide sweeping themes in fantasy. You'll have some of that too, but they tell it in a less specific way. You know,
Yeah.
it becomes more of the macro than the micro. So there is that.
Yeah, definitely. And that's so and the subgenre kind of gives you like the premise of like, okay, how you should be viewing certain things, right? So when you realize that it's sci-fi fantasy, you have to, and that brings up to your point, Eric, is that you have to now have to, you know, take away the, well, that wouldn't work. And how does that, it's because it's fantasy. So you have to lend yourself to like, okay, I have to take reality, some form of reality out of this and just enjoy the whole, the fantastic part of it, and that's, when you look at Star Wars, that's why it even opens up, a long time ago in the galaxy far, far away. We often talk about once
Hmm.
upon a time in it,
Yep.
in the land far, far. It's the classic story tropes, right? And there are certain things that Star Wars has that makes, and we talked about this when we did the What is Star Wars, that there's certain things that Star Wars has to have in order for it to function as a Star Wars film or a Star Wars show, as opposed to some other franchise,
Well,
right?
now we're getting to
Mar
what makes it unique.
Exactly.
So we defined what it is. Now it comes a time because basically, if I remember what you had suggested correctly, you were talking about,
Mhm.
let's talk about what it is and what sets it apart, then what makes it unique to it in and of unto itself, and then of course what went wrong and how can they fix it, and then of course what were some of the projects within the Star Wars franchise that resonated with fans and which ones not so much. And was storytelling to blame for some of this? I mean, because
Mhm.
obviously you can have a great story. I mean, the prequels, I think, are the big example of this, where
Yeah.
you have a really good, solid story, but there were a lot of issues with the execution, and that's what maybe marred it a little bit. But it wasn't the
Mhm.
storytelling. And then, of course, years later, I think people have been more forgiving simply because, well,
Yeah, the sequels.
yeah. All right, let me get this comment in from Ronaldo before we go any further. He says, I think Andor was the only Star Wars project that was more sci fi than fantasy. I well,
I Yeah,
I guess, but it was
I
also
would lean
really,
to that.
it is. Well, but it's actually more war than lore, too, right? So I guess
True.
if you're. If you're confining the fantasy element to just the Force, the Jedi, the Sith, and all that stuff, yeah, because that's another interesting thing too. Is it sci-fi fantasy because of that, or are there any other things in there that are more fantasy elements?
Um, no, I mean, I think when you look at Rogue One, and this is what we were talking about when we actually did a Rogue One review, right?
Yep. Part of
We
our What
talked
is Star
about
Wars thing.
we talked about things being grounded in reality, and that was a cool thing that Star Wars did, was they allowed Star Wars to become more tangible, almost, where it felt like this is happening somewhere, and it's just like set in the backdrop of Star Wars. When we saw Scarif, I mean, it looked like, Panama Beach or something like that. It was in a place, and you're seeing, how the war is affecting the people, people being oppressed by it, those types of things. Sure, you still got, AT-ATs walking around, or you know you still have this whole Death Star thing that's being, I mean, granted, there is more fantasy in that, but I mean, you can also see
Yeah, I mean
it's
that
not,
does
you know
rely on sci-fi. Well, here's something that David brings up,
okay.
and he's misguided as usual, but we can set him straight. So he says the Jedi aren't superheroes, so the subgenre isn't superhero. What is a subgenre if the Jedi aren't superheroes? Also, what movie has a similar storytelling method to Star Wars? Well, that's just it. Number one, there really isn't a whole lot. I mean, you could
Yeah,
go
it
to
really isn't.
projects, fantasy projects like the Never-Ending Story, um, Dark Crystal, other
uh
various fantasy projects that have a
like I
similar
said, Harry
thing.
Potter.
Harry Potter. You have to remember that he took a lot from, what was his name? Joseph Campbell Kurosawa.
Campbell.
So he took a lot of the samurai elements. That's where the Jedi came from. The Jedi aren't superheroes. They're more like wizards. And wizards,
Mhm.
King Arthur's court, right? Yeah, Merlin.
Yep.
Usually,
Merlin.
if you look at the movie Crawl,
Lord Lord of the Rings, kind of ish.
yeah,
You have to
because
put
the
that in
other,
there.
that's a good point too. That's total fantasy, right? Yeah, how can I forget Lord of the
Hmm.
Rings? But the thing is
Hmm.
that what makes these type of things is you usually have, again, fantasy usually deals in broad themes, and that's
Yeah.
what Star Wars does. the Jedi are likened to the wizards. You know, you always usually have a wizard somewhere in there in the fantasy realm, or an old mage, somebody to guide. And now we're getting into the storytelling of the hero's journey, which is like a classic storytelling device where you basically have, you know, a young man has something happen. They set out on an adventure. There's usually an older, wiser person who's there to guide them, and they come out the other side growing from a boy into a hero. That's why it's called the hero's journey. It's a classic
Yeah.
storytelling trope that a lot
Mm-hmm.
of different things have used, and Lucas basically brought that into Star Wars. So you have to remember that one of the things that sets Star Wars apart is that it's an amalgamation of a lot of different classic storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
You have your fairy tales, you have the hero's journey, you have Kurosawa and his whole like samurai type of a thing. You have a lot of
Yeah.
these different elements that he basically perfectly combined to make this very entertaining thing. Now, of course, one of the problems that he had was he did flesh quite a bit of this out, he and his team. But as time went on, especially once the expanded universe hit, well, now it's like, well, how does a lightsaber work? And, you know, how fast
Mm-hmm.
is hyperspace and or hyperspeed
Yeah.
or whatever? You know, I mean, it's kind of like you have all these. This is where the sci-fi element comes in, to where now you have to start to try to explain some of this stuff. But Lucas really didn't want people to get involved in the minutia of it. You know, he would
Right.
always dismiss people's questions a lot of time and just be like, look, just don't worry about it. There's
Yeah,
a
it's just a little
broader
bit.
theme. You know, if you look at the whole Skywalker saga, right? What's it about? I mean, you got the hero's journey, but it's also about
Redemption.
redemption. Yeah, I mean that's essentially, if you had to boil it down to one word, that's what it would be. And again, these are very broad themes. And then of course
Yeah, I
we
mean,
move into the other projects, maybe not so much, but right now I'm
yeah.
assuming we're talking about the original trilogy, right?
Yeah, well, at this point, yeah, the original trilogy. I mean, and another big one that you can utilize is the Wizard of Oz,
Oh yeah,
because
big time.
essentially, like Luke Skywalker's Dorothy,
Yep.
and on the way he meets Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia and Chewie, and they're like the Tin Men and the Cowardly Lion, and now they're going out. They meet the Wonderful Wizard, which is basically like Yoda or Obi-Wan. I mean, it's kind of that once again that, but the Wizard of Oz is a classic story that most people have either heard of or have seen or read about. To that point, there's a lot of biblical reference. David. You should probably see the overarching things in that where, okay, Anakin's mother just became pregnant with the Force
Yep.
by the
He's the
Force. It's
Mary,
like
he's the
she's the Mary.
Force
He's Jesus. It's
Jesus, the Force is God,
Force
you know. I
Jesus.
mean, it's
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. Yeah,
basically
exactly.
you do, yeah, he borrowed
He
a lot of,
sacrificed himself
yep.
for his son humanity. I mean, it's the whole, like I said, you're taking classic things that most people will have seen or read or understand and can conceptualize, and he basically kind of made a big gumbo out of it that was just perfectly seasoned with enough of everything where everybody was just like, man, that was really, really good. To even further solidify the point, I would say Star Wars is almost like a film version of Michael Jackson. And the reason why I say that is, everyone heralds Michael Jackson as this phenomenal entertainer, which he was. But the thing about Michael is that, like, most of the things that he did, he borrowed from other artists and he kind of combined it with his own thing and made it his thing. So, like, he's popularized the moonwalk, but he never created it. A lot of the robotic movements and stuff like that was just done. He saw kids in the neighborhood doing it, and he was like, "Cool, let me just add that to my repertoire." He followed Fred Astaire, who's a phenomenal dancer, and he took tap stuff from Gregory Hines and I forgot the other guy that was. But yeah, like he's taken all these different disciplines, miming. He's added that into a lot of his dance moves. So it's like everyone looks at Michael's like, man, like how did he's just taking things that he likes from different things, and he's like, okay, I'm gonna pour that into myself and then present it and repurpose it to everybody else. And everyone's like, oh my God, he's this brand new artist. And it's like, well, yes and no. It's stuff you all seen before. It's just he
Right, but never
repackaged it in such a
combined
way
in
that
never combined
passion.
in that particular way. And
Yeah,
that's something that people respond to. And of course, I think that that's pretty much what it was. I mean, when Lucas basically couldn't get the rights to Flash Gordon, he's like, all right, you know what? I'm going to make my own Flash Gordon. But now he's probably thinking, well, I don't really want to remake this thing verbatim, right? Because I don't want
right,
it to be too derivative.
right.
So I think he just started looking around and saying, okay, well, what can I do? And that's when he started looking at some of the things that influenced him. Because remember, he went to film school.
Yep.
And I mean, he basically learned a lot of these things. That's probably where he got a lot of this stuff from. He used
Hmm.
all this and said, you know what? Let me take all these classic, timeless influences and combine them in such a way that it creates this brand new experience. And that's why so many people respond to this.
Absolutely.
That's why it's
How
been timeless. And that's why Disney has been slowly but surely making the mistake of trying to do things that will undo all that. Like, for instance, starting to be very specific in some of the themes that it deals with, stuff that relates to society today. It's like the worst thing that you can do
hmm
for this franchise, because the reason why it's lasted so long is because it speaks to all generations, because it has a timelessness to it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, and I think that's the biggest part is it doesn't have the spirit into it.
Right.
And that's where it's almost kind of like you're trying to capitalize on the name and you're trying to capitalize on what's been built, but without the the soul of something. It's just like, all right, let me just remember weekend at Bernie's when they were trying to animate his body and stuff to make him do stuff. That's basically kind of like what they're doing with Star Wars. It's like, oh look, this is Star Wars. Let me just make it look like it's moving, and yeah, you guys should buy into it. And we're like, that's not what Star Wars is. Star Wars is alive in a certain way. So I think that's where this conversation really is. It's going to end up is where does it, we know what it is and we understand why it's so unique. And now you have to have like the things that really bring it to life, and I think where does it need to go? We've already, as in our other shows, we've already established the fact that like, okay, it needs to get away from the Star Wars saga. I mean, not the Star Wars saga, but the Skywalker saga. Now, how do you tell those timeless stories now in modern with modern technology, with different and I think you have to think of more so modern themes that everyone can that's kind of like a timeless theme that people can relate to.
Well, but
And
then
that's really
again,
having a pulse of the people.
yes and no, because if you look at a lot of when a lot of these influences were created that Lucas took back in 1977, well, probably more like 74,
Yeah,
75 when he
far
was actually,
right.
creating
Writing
this
it.
thing, right? Yeah. But still, I mean, a lot of those were generally archaic by that point. I mean, if you look at Lord of the Rings, everybody loves it. They even have a TV series on it now that's on Amazon Prime. That thing was written, like 100 years ago or something stupid.
Hmm.
So, I mean, the timeless themes are exactly that. They're timeless. If you start getting too much into the specificity of what's affecting today and, well, what can today's audience relate to? What can today's kids relate to? See, the whole idea that Lucas is trying to establish was this is the classic good versus evil, the moral of the story. And I mean, that's the reason why he said it's so successful. Like we as fans, because we grew up and we still want to live in this universe, we're saying, oh, well, now, let's explore the gray, right? Because the world's not black and white and on it goes. But Lucas's point was like, no, that's the point. you tell the men in the white hat, the men in the black hat, the good guy, the bad guy, because you're essentially making this for kids, and you're trying to show and teach through this thing. And that's the reason why it was so effective. So now what you have to do is you have to figure out a way that you can expand this story and still keep the essence of what he created, which would ensure his success. And for me, I still say the expanded universe did it brilliantly. Because if you read the expanded universe books, they explore a lot of themes. Like it's very much more adult. Like I think it's one of those things, and this is where Star Wars hits it on the mark, right? Is when it appeals to kids, but adults still get something out of it too. So it's not like you're throwing on Blue's Clues for your kid and just you're you're just like, this is like I'd rather be right. I'd rather be waterboarded than watch another minute of this. That's.
I'm sorry. I'm just getting. I had a visual. Some poor parent is just.
Well, it's basically it. It's so funny. Like when you talk to parents, because let's face it, most people that are in our age range are parents. Mine are approaching grandparents at this point, and it's you hear all the stories, right? I mean, we don't have any kids, but I mean, you hear all these nightmare stories about, like, I basically can't watch anything other than this stuff for probably like 5 years or something. But
yeah, I mean, well, when I'm saying like when I say modern themes, I don't mean like necessarily like there's different, like keeping the timelessness of it, definitely. As far as like the good and the evil part, absolutely. What I'm saying is like the heroes struggle to overcome certain things. So like for Luke, it was all right. Him discovering that his father is basically like the worst dad in the world. He's basically been, like literally the worst dad in the world because he's been terrorizing the galaxy for like 20 years at this point. It's just like, okay, I don't know who my father is. I know I'm called to do something great, but I don't know what it is. And my surrogate parents won't let me go. And then I find out that my actual dad, is a maniac. So
it's funny if you explore that.
What do I do with this?
Well, if you just explore the first three movies, right, the original trilogy, I mean, he didn't exactly get the most complete guidance in the world. He had to
exactly.
I mean, he was
cobble that thing together.
He had to cobble it together. He wasn't really getting straight answers out of these people, and he had to figure it out. By the time he finds out who his father is, he's missing a hand thanks to his father. I mean, he's not really sure. I mean, when you really stop and think about it and put yourself in Luke's shoes, he really.
That's what I'm saying. See, that's the part I'm talking about. Like that's the essence I'm talking about right there. Is like his struggle as far as because it's different than Rey's was.
Well, that's like part of the hero's journey story, though, right? Is that
right? Exactly.
The hero's got to struggle.
So that's what I'm talking about. Just figuring out, okay, what struggle is this hero going to go through that's going to lead them to becoming as they're trying to fight this black hat, so to speak.
Well, you could even say that we basically got Han Solo's version of the hero's journey story in the Solo movie.
Yeah.
He had to do the same thing, right? He starts out as just kind of this normal guy and, streetwise, like petty thief or something. And then he had to grow into the character that we meet by A New Hope. Now, of course, he grows even further.
Right.
But when you really stop and think about where he was at the beginning of Solo versus where he was at the end, and he had to learn all those lessons, it's a modified version because, he wasn't like the White Knight, so to speak. But he did very much go through his own hero's journey, which, of course, came to a conclusion in the original trilogy because, he was still kind of self-absorbed and, I mean, he had some problems.
He became a better,
right.
He became a better person.
Yeah.
His hero's journey kind of started in A New Hope, more or less.
Well,
It's just that
I
he
mean,
became a
yeah.
better person in Solo, like being,
Well,
you know,
yes and
kind of
no,
a
because he was trusting everybody. He was, he had to learn a lot of hard lessons through when Beckett betrayed him, through a
yeah,
lot of the other stuff. He had to grow. He had to learn to be less trusting of people. He had to learn to navigate the larger universe. He thought he was.
he got swindled by Lando at first in that first Sabat gang, and then
Yeah,
he
I mean,
realized, okay, I got to
there's a
give him
lot of
back.
hero's
Yeah,
journey in there. You
yeah,
could say that it concluded obviously in A New Hope, maybe Empire Strikes Back. That's probably where it solidified because he was still kind of on the fence. Like he did the right thing at the end of A New Hope, but he was still
hmm,
trying to be like, "Hey, man, I
all right,
I'm with you guys, but I really got to do this." And I mean, I still say to this day, they should have just let him go pay Jabba off. They would have saved
yeah,
so much headache if it's like, listen, let me just take a couple of days, fly back to Tatooine, pay this off, and then I can come back and I can be your general or whatever it is, or I think it was still a captain at
right,
that point, and just, you know, and they would have left him alone.
yep. The whole, well, then Empire probably
Well, no, I
wouldn't have been
get
as
it.
good
I
either.
mean, right.
Yeah, I know.
And that's part of it though. That's part of the storytelling,
Right,
right? Is that again, in reality, this is what they would have done. At
right.
least you would think so. Like, okay, yeah. So we're not being hunted by this whole other crime organization in addition to the Empire. Yeah, let's just take care of this debt and you'll be good. But again, that would mitigate some of the struggle that the character had to face in order to, because again, he had to make
Hmm.
the right decision. Do I bail on these guys when they're really at a low point or not? So and you know what? You could even it's stretching it a little bit because it's a little bit more minor, it's a little bit shorter, but Lando, you pointed it out too, sort of went through his own version of it
Hmm.
where he was
Well,
self-absorbed and everything, and then, he hooks up with the Empire and not the Empire. the the rebellion.
well, he did briefly at least.
Yeah,
But
yeah, that is true. Yeah. That's part of the
but
problem.
that exactly right. But I think that's what also brings us to, and I'm glad you're bringing up these different characters because that's the thing too. Is like the characters, right? When we talk about storytelling, you got to have great characters, and they have to have good motivations for certain things. That was one of the things that was so severely lacked in the sequel trilogy. It was the characters' motivations for a lot of stuff. You had some characters that were really like, okay, like Finn, like they did a pretty decent job with Poe. Like Poe, to me,
Yep.
I think they flushed him out a lot better because you saw, like, okay, look, he's this ace fighter pilot. He's kind of had the whole Maverick from Top Gun thing. Like, I know I'm good. I know I'm the best pilot out here. Just let me. And Leia even said, like, look, you can't just solve your world's problems by jumping in that X-wing and blowing something up. I mean, I love the fact that she just said it like so matter of fact like that. But it was true, and he really had to. Now we saw his journey go in a way that I thought was really impactful because he's realizing my choices, how these affect everybody else. Like I can't just think about me, and I have to be able to take direction, even though I think I know what's best. These other people who sit higher understand the bigger scope of it all, and I have to kind of quell my ambition and submit, and that was hard for him to do. And those are the things like when you said earlier, Eric, and you hit the nail right on the head when you said, he made these things for kids to teach them lessons, and that's one of those lessons where we all know kids think they know it all, and it's like you don't know squat because you haven't lived long enough to see it.
Well, not only that, but
And
Leia in I guess, the upper echelon of the
yeah, Hodo
resistance.
and
Yeah,
yeah,
they knew the big picture because for that it was about how to not just be an amazing fighter and how to be a leader. Like how do you transition to being an amazing leader? Because a leader really knows when to pull back, Whereas Poe never
Mm-hmm.
really learned that lesson. To him, everything was just engage, 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 right? So
Yep.
that's a good point. And you're right. That is, I would say, almost unequivocally, I'm sure there's probably people out there that would disagree though, but that's probably the one story arc that they got 100% right in that whole thing.
Yeah.
And it was allowed to breathe. There
Yes.
was what's
Yes.
her
Yep.
name? Something
Hodor.
Bliss. No.
Oh, Avar. No, I mean, not.
No. No, you're
I'm thinking
thinking of
about
our
Avar
Chris.
Chris.
Now
Chris. I'm sorry.
Ori Bliss or something. I'm so bad with this stuff now.
Oh, the chick with the helmet.
Yeah, the chick with the helmet. She was sort of like she- yeah,
Do
that's
the
right.
face.
We host a Star Wars show, everybody. That's us. The knowledgeable. We're the ones you come to. Imagine that. But yeah, she definitely was instrumental too. She was like that next, because she was somebody from his past. All right, let me get a couple of
Mhm.
these chats in before we go any further. Ronaldo says, to be fair, I don't think he took that debt very seriously. I don't
I
I don't know, man. I think he did, because if you think about it, so
I
first
think
he was all
yeah.
ready to do it at the end of A New Hope. He was loading the stuff on. He was ready to take it to Jabba. He was basically saying, look, we got a lot of debt we got to pay off with this. We got to get back. And he had a change of heart because he knew that they were
What they
against
were up
insurmountable
against.
odds, yeah, with the Death Star. So he went back to help them. But then the whole beginning of Empire Strikes Back, after he basically went after Luke, the whole thing up until the battle and they had to escape was him trying to fix the Falcon enough so they could get out of there so they could pay the debts. He even said, look, man, I'm basically loyal to this thing, but, I got this debt.
Got
And
a
of course,
bounty on my head.
yeah, and he said a
Look at it
death
one time,
mark.
he's like, it's not an easy thing to live
Yeah,
with. or
death
something.
mark is not an easy thing to live with. So it was understood that Solo wanted to go and pay this debt and then come back. And that's what he was on his way to do. But of course, that's when the Empire attacked, and that's when he basically had to get Leia and all them out. And once again, he was thwarted.
Mhm.
It wasn't until the end of the movie that obviously Boba Fett catches up with him. And then again, if you go into the War of the Bounty Hunter comic series, you'll find that it gets even more insane after that. So I don't know.
Yeah, Han trying to go back. Han trying to pay that debt is about. I really identify with Han trying to pay that debt because that's pretty much how I felt. Kept trying to go back to college. Like every time you keep trying to go back, something else pops up.
Oh,
It's like,
yeah.
son of a-
You're just like, you know what? I'm not meant to do this.
yeah, like Eastern goes on strike. I'm like, really?
There was some really
Yeah,
crazy.
you remember?
Yeah. To the point where I think I even said that. Like, I think,
Oh.
someone's telling you you're not meant to do this, man, because that's pretty crazy. But you're right. That's exactly what it was like. All right, David. David says, does Star Wars tell stories better than Marvel? I know they're different franchises. That's the point. Well, I would say yes, because, and again, you have to compare this to the earlier days of Marvel, because the earlier days of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that was a lot more where they were more like real movies in a lot of ways, and not these like CGI spectacles that they basically become. But you also have to understand that there's the source material. See, this is where everybody would compare it to Lord of the Rings or the Narnia Chronicles and all this stuff. It's like all the stuff in Star Wars came from George Lucas's head, ultimately. Yes,
Yeah.
there were other people who contributed to it, contributed significantly to it. But ultimately, Lucas was the one that had all this in his head. And when people would come to him with ideas or drawings or whatever the case may be, he would always be like, no, yes, no. And it's like he knew he knew what he wanted when he saw it, right? So
Mhm.
in some of the cases like that. And he did change some things, obviously. Like Darth Vader wasn't originally Luke's father. There were a few pivots that he made along the way, but it all came from his head. There was no source material for this. So that's something that cannot be understated. That's why it's really hard to take like 60 years of comic books and basically where all you have to do is adapt them. And don't get me wrong, I'm not minimizing what Marvel did, because that's part of why they're so successful, is the fact that they were able to adapt this stuff. But it's really more in the early days, because if you look at the original Iron Man, the original Thor, they were a lot more grounded, and people responded to that. And I think that that's part of what makes Star Wars special as well, is that Star Wars never gets lost in its technology and its spectacle. It's very grounded. You know, Lucas started out saying, I want a lived-in universe. I don't want it to be pristine. A lot of sci-fi back then was very clean and pristine and clinical.
Mhm.
He wanted it to be dirty and grimy and lived in. That's a big thing that separated it from like your 2001, your Star
Mhm.
Treks, your, you know, a lot of the sci-fi of the time. We had the clean white suits and, you know, all this other stuff.
Yeah.
This felt like it was lived in, and it was never really, the technology in Star Wars was just taken for granted. It was just part of daily life, no different than,
Yeah.
you know, what we have now, right? I mean,
hmm
especially now. So I think that that's another thing that plays into it a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, even when you look at like Star Trek, they focus on the technology. Like
Yep.
for example, you go to the replicator. Earl Grey tea, hot, and you watch this thing materialize and it's piping hot and it's at the perfect temperature or whatever. Like you hardly see anybody eat or drink in Star Wars. Because it's not that's not the focus. Like the focus is the overarch, like you said, the overarching theme. Um, I would say, yeah, and I would say Star Wars is a tells better stories. It's at least the um and it's kind of a hard thing to do because when you're saying Marvel has so many different entities within it. You got the X-Men, Spider-Man, Iron Man, whereas Star Wars is like at least the first six were like it's a continuous thread. Well, and actually nine now,
Yeah,
technically.
well, it is kind of an apples and oranges kind of a thing. I mean, it
Yeah.
is tough to compare the two, really, but I mean, I guess if you know, the
You almost
comics
have to
told timeless
compare.
stories too. So, I mean,
You
to be
almost have to
fair,
compare it. Yeah, that's what. To be fair, you have to base it on the merit of what the story is trying to do. So, if you're trying to do science fantasy, does Star Wars do that really well? Yes, well, at least at first. If you're
for a
if you're
while
talking
anyway.
of yeah, exactly right. If you're talking about superheroes, like the better comparison would like does Marvel do it better than DC? That would be more of a better comparison because they're both obviously
Yeah,
comic book
right.
and you got the same type of style of characters and things of that nature. So that would be more comparable. You would compare Star Wars, like I said, to Narnia, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, that type of thing. So I think that's a better equivalent
Well, here's
to
David
that.
tries to clarify this a little, I think. He says, when you sit in the
Okay.
theater and watch Star Wars versus Marvel, which one tells the story better? For example, Dark Phoenix is a great story, but the movie didn't tell the story well. And I mean, you can you could probably, I mean, I hate to say it,
Yeah,
you can find examples in
for
both
both.
where
Yeah.
they were on sometimes, they weren't other times. I mean, I think
Uh,
that if you're dealing with the original trilogy, you know, I mean, it's flawless filmmaking essentially. I mean, you know, these are movies that are considered the greatest of all time. Like they transcend their genre, which is why I would automatically give it to Star Wars.
yeah.
Simply because
Eh,
Star Wars transcends its genre. It's just
Yeah. It goes beyond what it was confined to.
yeah, it's
Um,
it's just it's great filmmaking, it's great storytelling, and it's not so dependent on its setting or anything else. I mean, you could tell these stories basically in any genre of film.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you could, when the times that Marvel is on, you could probably do something similar in that sense too, because, you know, they're basically taking the same thing. I mean, when you look at the Spider-Man story, that's a hero's journey story.
Absolutely.
You know, he had Ben to guide him, and then that's taken from him, and now he has to
Mm-hmm.
go it alone, and he has to figure it out, and he has his Aunt May there to more or less provide some sort of semblance of stability, but you could basically make that argument. And because again, that why were these comics that were largely written in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, at least their
Mm-hmm.
origins, right? I mean, you know, they
Yep.
publish
No,
them
yeah.
today. But that's when they were created. Why do these characters, these superhero characters, still resonate with us? Why are we still talking about Superman and Batman and Spider-Man
Mm-hmm.
and, you know, all these other ones? It's because, once again, it's a timeless storytelling thing. It's telling things that people relate to. The only differences are that comics a lot of times will, because they're ongoing publications, they will sometimes get into story arcs that reflect the specific time period in which it's written.
True.
Whereas some of your best, what we would call timeless classics, wouldn't do that, because obviously that would, now they're not timeless if you do that. You might do
Yeah.
the themes, but you don't get into the specifics.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like like if you took a genre like James Bond, for example, you have James Bond, and then you have like Jason Bourne, right? Both are dealing in espionage. So like there's themes that deal with that espionage deals with. 9 times out of 10, it's more global, right? You're dealing with something that's going to affect more than just that one person. It's usually something that deals with that's going to affect countries, the world, things of that nature. So the nature of espionage lends itself to this. So you already know what you're getting into as far as a story. It's got to affect a wide range of people. But then like there's a reason why James Bond has certain elements to it that make or that adorn the story that makes it a Bond film as opposed to a Jason Bourne film. It has its own adornments that makes it a Jason Bourne film. Well, of course, we know with Bond, you got to have a Bond girl. That's like number one. Then we also have to have, especially like in the old days of like Roger Moore, Sean Connery, you always have to have some megalomaniac, villain. You always had, and they usually are trying to acquire, they're trying to do something, like I said before, doing something with the world, whether it's Goldfinger with the, stealing, I mean, radiating all the gold. So only his gold is worth more money that people now are going to pay him to use his gold because the other gold isn't, usable. You have, I think was it Tomorrow Never Dies? Is that the one with the media mogul? I thought that was an interesting thing. 'Cause
Yeah.
that's when media really started to, but that was a cool one. They did one with the oil.
Oh, it's always something like that, right?
It's
Where
always something
like,
global, right?
I only want Swiss cheese in the world, so I'm gonna nuke out all the other cheeses. So only Swiss cheese, and I happen to own the only Swiss cheese company. So it's always something kind of crazy like that.
Exactly.
Or then you get the guys that they don't even care. It's like, yeah, I want to pull the moon down to the Earth's orbit or something stupid. I mean, you always have like these over the top villains, and then eventually they even started creating like the over the top henchmen. Odd Jaws,
Knick-Knack and
yep. Yeah, exactly. So, you even had these sub characters almost.
Right. And then you have the gadgets and all that stuff. So that's kind of what adorns James Bond. Of course, you got to see him, order a drink. You gotta hear, okay, he's gotta, bed down the Bond girl at some point, So there's certain beats that James Bond has to hit for it to feel like a Bond film. Right?
Exactly. Otherwise, it wouldn't feel like a Bond film, and that's a good point. Now, Ronaldo says, here's another way that Star Wars deals from Star Trek. Star Wars is cool.
Oh.
All right.
I
didn't even pre-read that one before I put it up, so that actually kind of took me by surprise. Here, I thought it was going to be some,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
thought out like comparison or whatever. David says you can compare different genres. Orphan was better storytelling than Thor 2 and 4. I mean, you can, I guess. Orphan's a horror film. They also had Orphan 2. I haven't seen either one of them, but I'm aware of them. I mean, yeah, you could say, but now you're getting into, because you have to understand too that what makes storytelling in one genre might not necessarily make storytelling in another genre. Now, obviously, nobody would argue the fact that good storytelling is good storytelling. And as I've said, in the case of Star Wars, it transcends the genre that it was actually in.
That's a rarity, mind you.
It
That's
is.
not always, and that's something that can't be understated, because when we're talking about storytelling, it's when you say it transcends. So, like, you just made a comparison to like Thor versus a horror film. So you can have great storytelling in both, and they're both can be phenomenally told, right? But does it? Can you like say like, okay, man, like the themes, the cinematography, the direction, the act,
Well,
like all
you
those things
could.
kind of come together
I actually
to
get what he's
really make it
saying.
a great film.
I mean, what he's saying is, I mean, I hate to say it's true from a certain point of view, right? I mean,
Oh,
because you can compare them, and because what he's doing is he's looking at them for their own movies, right? He's saying that
mhm.
Orphan told its story in its genre better than Thor 2 and 4. And you could say that. You could
Yes.
say for what it was trying to do. The only problem with that is that, again, you're doing a little bit of the apples and oranges. It's not so much that you can't compare them. It's more like, why would you? Why would you compare things that are so different like that? For instance, if you want to talk about things that transcend and you want to talk about the horror genre, that's why we still talk about the original Halloween film,
Hmm.
because Halloween transcended its genre. In fact, it set the standard. A lot of people go, it's the one that everybody copies, which is true. It wasn't the original slasher film. You can make the argument that Psycho was.
Yeah.
If not Psycho, you could definitely make the argument that Black Christmas was back in 74. Both movies came out well before Halloween did. But Halloween was the one that made the impact. That was the one where it's filmmaking, it's storytelling, it's acting, it all just clicked and influenced everything that came after it. And that's another thing you have to look at. You have to look at
Influence.
what came after. Like, is it highly influential? Star Wars is the same thing. As soon as Star Wars came out, everybody was trying to copy Star Wars. And if you look at all the movies, not necessarily the television shows, but if you look at all the movies that copied Star Wars, they're all missing something. They have good cinematography, a lot of them. They have a good
Mhm.
story, but they're missing something. They're missing that it factor, that thing that transcends the genre. And that's
And
what you have to look at.
it's usually the timelessness of it.
Yes.
That's usually what it is. It's kind of like Ralph Lauren, has been around for ages. Back when Eric was 9 years old, people were wearing Ralph Lauren polo shirts. In 2024, people are still paying an exorbitant amount of money for Ralph Lauren polo shirts, because it's just a timeless thing. It's a timeless brand. Like,
Yep.
everyone
See,
pretty
look. No,
much
I'm just
knows it. Right. Like, I want to
I'm
know.
wearing one right now.
but, but
Look, I got the matching pants.
as long as you don't show the underwear, we're
Yeah,
fine.
that's right. Yeah, right. Exactly.
But but yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's one of those timeless brands, or like people say Kleenex, because it's like facial tissue, but Kleenex is the brand. Everyone said, "Do you have any Kleenex?"
That's right. They don't
Just
say, do you have any puffs?
Right, exactly.
Yep.
So, and that's one of those things where like it just becomes such um a titan,
Well,
and
it's in the cultural vernacular, right? Like a Coke.
yeah,
Everybody asks for a
yep,
Coke. They don't always mean a cola. Like, well, they mean a cola, but
right.
they don't always mean specifically Coke. People are just trained to say that.
Hmm.
I mean, there's so many different brands like that where, yeah, you identify them based on the brand. It transcends its own brand to the point where it's now substituted for the actual thing. So
Right.
that's a
Like
good point,
Google
actually.
it.
Yep,
Like you just
exactly.
instead of saying search,
Right.
Google it.
Use a search engine. It's like, well, just Google the thing.
Yep.
Exactly. Every
So,
smart device becomes an iPhone. Can I borrow
exactly.
your iPhone? What's an Android? Well, whatever.
Yeah, whatever. Exactly.
So, I mean, there are certain things and certain films do that. And that's one of the things that Star Wars has done it's why it's done that. And that's why. So now we can look at, knowing all this, what projects are people responding to that fit this definition within the Star Wars franchise versus which ones missed the mark, which really isn't
Ma-
that tough
Ma-
because it's
right.
not.
Mandalorian and Andor are the two that sticks out at least. In my Rogue One,
Yep.
which is basically an offshoot of
Yeah,
Andor.
if we're talking about all the newer stuff, it'd be a lot
Yeah.
easier because look, there's other things that were, I guess, arguably good, but not what we're talking about. They're not,
Yeah, I mean,
you know.
Mandalorian and Andor were critically acclaimed. Those were like, wow, okay, this is really good. And I think once again, you had a great story. Um, I think they took they had the right elements, especially with the Mandalorian. You had a great character, a cool character that had some mystery to him. He You didn't know, like, okay, is he a good guy or a bad guy? He's kind of I guess you want to call him somewhat of an anti-hero in a way. But then you introduce him with, Grogu, which, completely turned that franchise on its head. Um, Almost instantaneously. Like the moment we saw like as a baby Yoda, everybody went nuts. You know. And they kept that his whole identity a mystery for a while, which I thought that was a really cool thing to do. Because even it kind of married along with the actual character of Yoda, because Yoda is still a mystery to a lot of people. Um, but I think the whole bounty hunter thing it took away the mysticism that you would usually get with the Sith and the Jedi, and it got to ground it. Like I could see, I mean, you actually do have real bounty hunters in real life. Like
Oh
there's,
yeah.
so like once again, people. I mean, there was a whole reality show, Dog the Bounty Hunter. So like people are kind of used to following. Oh, okay, this is a bounty hunter reality show, almost like in space, and we're watching him run around and doing all this stuff. But then now you're bringing in these cool characters like the late Carl Weathers, Grief Karga. You're bringing in Cara Dune, um, and then um, what's his name on the show? Well, it's
Talking about Bill
um,
Burr's character,
Bill Burr, yeah, uh,
Miggs
Mayfield,
Mayfield.
Mix Mayfield. Mix Mayfield was such a cool character. I wish they would like bring him back in, but um, yeah, they told really good stories. You had a great villain in Moff Gideon, and I think they just really kind of, but they also expanded the lore in a bit because you're kind of talking about the Force, but not talking about it, which
Well,
I thought was
right.
a very interesting thing because it's like
Yep.
they keep trying to get Grogu's blood, and it's like, okay, well, what do they? Because they're trying to harness it for something, and this is the reason why. Because we know he has the Force, but we're trying to harness it for a different purpose, which I thought was cool. Instead of making another giant weapon, such as like a Death Star, they're trying to weaponize the Force almost in a way, which I thought that was an interesting twist.
That was cool. I mean, the other thing that I really appreciated from The Mandalorian was the fact that, okay, the first season obviously was devoid of any, I mean, other than the little bit that we saw Grogu do,
Hmm.
but it was mostly devoid of the Force. And then you started bringing in Luke and Ahsoka, and, you started having a little bit more of a Force element. But what was cool was it wasn't the focus, though. Like, it was almost
Right.
like there were moments that bridged other moments together, but it wasn't the total focus. All right, so now David says, I thought comparing genres was part of today's topic, showing that Star Wars' storytelling is superior to other genre movies. Example, Andor is better than The Flash, and Reba is better than Ahsoka. I mean, we are, in the sense of we're talking about what separates Star Wars and why it's this timeless thing versus other franchises. I mean, you can go into it, right? Like, we talk about Cobra Kai all the time. That's another
Right.
really well-written franchise. I maybe the next Karate Kid, I don't know. Maybe it was okay. Karate Kid 3, I think, could have been better, but even Ralph Macchio was, I mean, he listening to him talk about the Karate Kid 3 is hilarious because there's what it should have been and what it ended up being. But
Mhm.
what we've been talking about this whole time is why you have these other beloved franchises that are well written, they're well executed, everything's cool, but why do they not hold the same place in people's hearts by and large? I mean, there's a lot of people that they hate Star Wars and love the Karate Kid franchise, for instance. I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about, by and large, why does Star Wars hold this cultural, decades-long place in people's hearts, generation after generation after generation? And that's what we've been covering. If you've been listening this whole time, you'll see that we've been covering that the whole time. That it's that perfect amalgamation. Like you brought up earlier, the Michael Jackson thing. Why
Mhm.
is Michael Jackson regarded as one of the greatest entertainers, singers in the world? Because he borrowed all these influences, combined them in a very unique way, and represented it to us, and
Mhm.
it became something unique and of its own. And that's pretty much what Star Wars has done. All right, so we got Scarif Scuttlebutt Podcast is with us. He says, "Evening,
Whoa.
gents. We'll be lurking while I edit." I'm not
Hey,
sure what
another
the
editor.
yeah, right? Another podcast.
Uh,
um,
oh, may the force be with you. That's what it is.
yeah, that's it. Okay, good. He's like, Reba McEntire? No, you got to understand. David has David has like
I could. Hey, no, I'm not mad at that because that's exactly what
I
I thought when
know.
I
I
first
at
saw it
first
too.
I
I
was
was like,
thinking, hey, we are comparing genres, right?
where's
Ted Adam Green comes in. He says mythology stories set in a non-current time tend to focus on core elements and tropes and don't become dated as easily or quickly. And that's exactly it. When Star Wars focusing on the broad strokes, the macro, the timeless elements, they're not focusing on the specificity, and that's why they stay timeless. Instead of picking like a particular event or something, they'll just kind of go over the basic things that make up that thing that are, because I mean, let's face it, everything that we face in history now has been faced over and over, right? Doomed to repeat ourselves. Um, so Scarif Scuttlebutt Podcast says, have the newer shows relied on more nostalgia instead of generating great stories?
Mm.
I would say
I
there are
some to
the member berries, right?
the member berries. Yes. Remember the time when speaking of Michael Jackson, everything
Yeah,
is a
remember
remember
the
the time
time?
moment.
We can break into a
But
little chorus of that.
but Yeah, no, I think in some ways, like when we're talking the films, yes, they do rely a lot of on the nostalgia of the original trilogy, especially the sequels. You know, because they knew it worked. So, but in their situation, in their case, when they're trying to craft the new stories with the old, it just it just wasn't executed as well as it could have been. And I think that's another thing where they just the execution of a lot of things. Um, David brought it up earlier when he's talking about Dark Phoenix, like great story but poor execution, and that's what the sequel trilogy suffered, greatly from. Was that I think some of the story parts in it were cool. It was just so executed poorly, especially when you get to Rise of Skywalker when everything is at a breakneck pace because you got to try to encapsulate the entire series in 3 hours.
Yes, they were
Which
as
I think they,
clumsy. They're as clumsy as they are stupid.
yes, spoken by the great Vader,
So
absolutely.
Scarif goes on to say, "I'm not against fan service, but sometimes a line can be crossed." And yeah, that's
Oh,
basically
100%, 100%.
that's basically what happens a lot of times. It's not so much that they're relying on the fan service and nostalgia so much as they're relying on the marketing and the trying to make a blockbuster film. They're trying to make a successful Star Wars film rather than just make a good Star Wars film and then letting the cultural
Success
phenomenon that it
come to it.
is do it. Yeah. Lucas never set out and said, I want to make this $1 billion franchise. He just did it.
Hmm.
But the problem is that what Disney's trying to do, because they spent like $4 billion on this thing, they're trying to make their money back and they're trying to make, and they have,
Hmm.
Force Awakens
Yeah.
grossed like over $2 billion. And I think Solo grossed just under $1 billion, and that was considered a flop for Star Wars. So that just shows you what a money making juggernaut it is. But look, they were focused too much on trying to make a money making film versus making a good one, and I think that that's where Disney has really jumped the shark, so to speak.
Yeah.
Spirit says, "I wish the writing of Star Wars lately could be more consistent across all the shows." Yeah. Well,
we're with your buddy on that one.
I don't know. I don't hold out much hope, unfortunately, but, that would be nice.
Well, I just like I said, I think there's the execution of a lot of things. Once again, Eric, again to your point of they're trying to make a successful film. It's kind of the thing that we warn kids nowadays. They're like, oh, okay, they want to go get a job because this is how much money they'll make because they're so hot on being rich. So they want to like, okay, well, I'm going to be a doctor or an attorney, or I'm going to be a rapper or a basketball player. They want to do these things not because they love it. It's because they want what comes with it. And that's the thing. It's like when you don't play the game with a Michael Jordan mentality, a Kobe Bryant mentality, when you don't play the things like when you love music like Prince, or, you know, if you're not studying the greats like Michael Jackson did, if you're not really into this and you're just doing it for the money, it's going to show. And that's what's happening, unfortunately, in Star Wars is that and you got people like Filoni who really want to try to tell really great stories. I don't doubt it. Dave Filoni is a phenomenal storyteller, along with John Favreau. But when you have a head like Kathleen Kennedy, I'm sure there's probably others in there who are probably like yes men and yes women to her. It's kind of hard when you're fighting that to try to make quality a quality product.
Yep. So Scarif goes on to say, it's strange to think that the best Star Wars has been authored by non-Star Wars fans. Empire Strikes Back, Rogue One, Andor, go figure. Yeah, the only thing I would correct is an Empire Strikes Back. That's still very much a Lucas thing. I mean, obviously it
Hmm.
was directed by Irvin Kershner and, was written by Lawrence Kasdan. So that's true. And we did point that out before, that
Right.
sometimes having a non-fan bringing a fresh approach is a good thing. Other times, maybe not so much. You want part of the thing that you need to do is you need to strike a balance, because you have. He says yes, but you get my point. Yeah, we get the point.
Oh yeah.
I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
we
Yeah.
because and we've made that point ourselves in other shows, actually, where we've talked about Andor in particular. You have, Tony Gilroy, who came on and he really didn't even see much Star Wars. He wasn't a fan. Oh, my light went out. Oh well. At least I'm still visible. It's amazing how that blue background light actually does make quite a difference, though. But
Oh yeah.
essentially, you have a situation where sometimes they can bring a fresh approach to it, because they're not so trapped in the lore. They're not so trapped in the fandom. On the other hand, it's nice when you get somebody like a Dave Filoni who knows that whole thing inside and out, who can have a lot of the nuances. There's a lot of, because you can make the same argument for the expanded universe, right? There were a lot of writers that came into it that were Star Wars fans, but there were a lot that came into it that weren't. And yet both told very interesting, cool stories. So I agree. I don't necessarily think that being a fan is a prerequisite to making a
No.
good Star Wars film. Maybe you can make the argument that it can make a slightly different one. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like you can have a little bit of a different spin, but I would agree sometimes the non-fans are going to make the better films or shows.
Do you think that and we've kind of talked about this before, but when you have a director who's also the writer, do you think that that's a part of the problem? Like you need this separation almost of church and state in a way, where you need someone who's just strictly the writer of the film, and then you have a director, as opposed to a one person like a Ryan Johnson trying to do both, and because they're going to be so married to the to the two that they may not be able to see the problems clearly.
I mean, you can make the argument that some of the more successful ones, I mean, the only one that you can really look at that mirrored that situation was A New Hope. It was written and directed by George Lucas.
Right.
So one time where his directing didn't ruin the film. But, then you look at the prequels, though. And you might have, I would say that that would be the thing.
And then you still have someone like Spielberg come in and
Scarif could basically, he agrees with you. He basically says, balance is a hard part for sure. It makes a funny comment. Your light went out. It can only mean one thing: invasion. He says, oh, yes, I remember when a director would direct and a writer would write. Yeah, that's exactly.
Mhm.
And then he goes on to say that he agrees with you on that one. And I would say the same thing. I think that it's better if the director focuses on directing, getting the best performance out of the actors, kind of, running the ship a little
Mhm.
bit, and the writers focus on actually writing the content, coming up with the story. I mean, because look, everybody has to remember too that even the writers that wrote the scripts, Lucas is the one that came up with the story. It wasn't like Kasdan came in and, just wrote The Empire Strikes Back. Lucas told him, hey,
Right.
this is what the story is going to be. And of course, they went
Mhm.
back and forth and there were some rewrites and things like that. So I do think that it's important to have somebody like a Dave Filoni there to oversee and maybe generate the story ideas. I mean, the way that I think Star Wars should work in the future, honestly, is get Filoni to be the new Lucas. Let him generate the stories. give it to a writer to write it, give it to a director to direct it.
Mm.
You know, now you're
Okay.
mirroring The Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. You're mirroring that sort of thing by doing that.
All right, Eric. I'm feeling it.
That would be, but you know, what do I know? All right, David says the early movies had great actors to be the face of the franchise. They could benefit from having a strong face of the franchise like The Matrix had great actors to be its face. Well, the thing that's interesting about that, too, that can't be understated either. You had the right actors, and remember, they were all virtually unknown back then. Even
Yep.
Harrison Ford. I mean, he did American Graffiti, he did a couple of projects, but he wasn't Harrison Ford,
Harrison
right?
Ford, right?
You know, he was just another newcomer, basically. You know, Carrie Fisher had a certain pedigree because of her parents, but she was still untested. I mean, you had a few people. I mean, Alec Guinness was really the only name actor, really. So you cannot understate the chemistry of the actors. If you had different actors in A New Hope and basically the original trilogy, it may not have been as successful. Even if you had
Yeah.
everything else exactly the same and you didn't change any other variables, you just had different actors in there. You know, it just goes to show you. And basically, Scuttlebutt says the same thing. He says, "Look, that was lightning in a bottle for sure."
Yeah, I mean, even George having the wherewithal to like, even though you had Prowse in the suit, you didn't have him voice Vader. Like, you went and got a voice actor
Well, yeah,
or someone to do the voice. I mean, the
because
fact
they
that you
heard
got
him and
Jordan
they're like,
Wilkins-
"Yeah, dude, that doesn't sound like." Even though it's too bad because in that documentary that they did not too long before he died,
Mhm.
they actually shot the scene like in Return of the Jedi. He had commissioned because he really wanted to do that. That was like a thing for him, and they actually shot it with him. I don't even remember how they came up with the set or whatever. I mean, it was actually really cool. It's an amazing documentary. I think it's called "I Am Your Father," the David Prowse story, something like that. I would highly recommend it. It's on streaming somewhere. You can always find it. But besides it being a really compelling story and a very well done documentary, if for no other reason, just to see this reshoot of the end of Return of the Jedi when he's unmasked, but with David Prowse. And he actually did a couple of things where he started doing the Vader voice and he got it down. But see, he's had James Earl Jones that he can emulate now. Because now he
Right.
knows, oh yeah, this
What
is
Vader
what
sounds like.
right, this is what it's supposed to sound like. But back then, you know, he's
Right.
just spouting off in his, you know, usual Scottish accent or whatever, and George is like, yeah, it's not gonna work for this. Let's see. So Scarif says some of the marquees in the theaters had Alec Guinness and Peter Cushing as the top billing talent. Yes, of
Oh, yeah,
course,
Peter
Peter
Cushing,
Cushing
yep.
being the other
Yep.
name actor, and yep, absolutely, because you know everybody else is like. I mean, it was so
Who?
funny because people were even when they were shooting this, nobody really, you know, they're all like, I don't even know what this is,
Mhm.
and it's just really funny when you think about it. Especially being alive back then, me being, you know, a 6-year-old kid, soon to be 7, in the theater watching this for the first time, and you're trying to process it because again, you've never seen anything like that in your life. And you know, it's hard to recreate that magic. And that's another thing because, you know, people could basically make like these special effects extravaganzas on their home computers now. It's a little harder to wow. You know, you can still tell when money's spent. I mean, just look at Obi-Wan versus the films, right? You're like, okay, this is a little bit lower of a budget. I could tell. But, you know, these are the kinds of things that you have to do. You have to make storytelling the king. And I think that that's one of the things that Star Wars does probably, arguably, better within its franchise than a lot of these other things. And that's It's kind of like Scarif said, it was all lightning in a bottle. If you change any one thing, it probably wouldn't be as successful. Same thing with the original Halloween. If you changed out the actors, if you changed out some of the things that they ran into that were production things. Jaws, another great example, right? The mechanical shark didn't work. So they're like, well, great, we got to do something. So they came up with the idea of the barrels. Okay, now you're not seeing the shark as often as they had intended, but it actually made it a better, more timeless film. That's why that movie is better than other shark movies.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really more than just the source material or, the story or whatever. It's really a combination of all the different elements that come together. And the challenge for Star Wars is they just have to keep repeating that.
Yeah, definitely. I think with Star Wars, you just really have to just really get into the spirit of it all.
Yep.
You really, if you're going to tell those stories, you really have to have uh, a really good grasp on the concept of what's timeless and what, like you said, George made the stuff for kids. That has to be in the forefront of your mind, because and what lessons are you trying to teach these kids? What and how are we going to? What are these characters' motivation? Like we have to get back to the motivation of some of these characters. Like Finn had a great motivation, and he was just underutilized. You
Yeah.
know, Ray had a great story, and they didn't execute that as well. And I think that, but when we got to Poe, though, Poe actually had a great story, and we talked about that earlier. It really shone through because we really got to see the growth and development of him over the last three films, and that's what the heart of the storytelling is. It's just really just understanding the core of it, and then adorning it with little things that makes things cool. But I
I would
think
even
what's been happening is that they're trying to do the cool stuff and not really focus on the core.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would even say that Han Solo's story arc in Force Awakens and Last Jedi was done really well. Because, he was once the big conquering hero and it freaked him out. So he retreated back to the life that he once knew and sort of ran
Hmm.
away from his own success. And it was about him
Yeah,
re-engaging and being the person that deep down he really was, just without the fear and, the baggage and all that other stuff. So, I mean, there were a lot of really great moments in the sequel trilogy that were handled incorrectly, um, or at least not as well as it could have been. And then there were other things that were actually done fairly well. You just have to peel back the layers and, look past the
hmm,
surface and maybe some of the poor filmmaking aspects to it. But yeah,
absolutely.
all right. So, I mean, I think that that's going to pretty much do it for this one. So tomorrow, it's going to be the show before Halloween. So we're going to try to do somewhat of a Halloween themed. I don't know if necessarily the topic might be. I mean, usually I've always tried to either, like, I remember one time we were going to do what's a Lego movie that's, they had a Star Wars Lego movie that was kind of Halloween themed, like Tales of the, I wish I can remember, that we were going to actually review, and then we never did it. But I remember last year, I don't even remember what the topic was, but I remember I had the pumpkin in the background, the old jack-o'-lantern lit up. I'll probably try to do that again, which will probably be good if I don't
Yeah, I
charge the
keep trying.
backlight battery. I gotta get one that's on power. Well, eventually we'll be in the basement thing and we'll actually be on the same set and baby steps. We're in the same house. We just have to now get to the point where we're on the same set. So this is still a temporary situation. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this little, I guess, dissection of the storytelling of Star Wars, what sets it apart from other franchises. why it's beloved, what it needs to do, what were some of the projects that resonated with fans, maybe some of the ones that didn't. Again, oh yes, Ronaldo says it's Lego Star Wars Terrifying Tales. Thank you. See, when Ronaldo's watching, I always know he's going to know the answer.
Yeah, man.
Because if he doesn't know it
Greatest
off the top
wingman.
of his head, he's going to look it up for us. It's kind of like a honorary producer of the show, actually.
Exactly. Well, he should be. I mean, he's been
I
around
know,
the longest.
right?
So.
Yeah, he has. Actually, that's true. He is one of the original viewers of this show. So we're always glad when Ronaldo's with us. And we're glad when all you guys are with us as well. Eventually, we'll start doing the call-in thing again. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, just watch for us tomorrow. And we'll be doing a somewhat Halloween-themed show. I don't know, again, if the topic is necessarily going to be that. But hey, it's going to be the show we do before Halloween. And of course, don't forget, coming up in, I don't know, a month is going to be our annual Thanksgiving, like night before Thanksgiving show that we always do on the Wednesday night.
Yeah.
And we always try to get our good friend Dave Kazi on with us, so hopefully he's available to do it again with us. And if you guys have any topic ideas that you want to submit, put them in the comments section. You can go on our Discord. You can put it there. We actually have a spot. We have a channel on our Discord for show ideas and things like that, because we really do want to hear from you guys. Like, what do you guys want to talk about on a Sunday or Monday night? So we're open to that. So until tomorrow, hopefully you guys can join us again. Hopefully you have a good Monday, and you're ready to do it all again with us tomorrow night. With that, I'm Eric Vansel.
I'm Daryl Sanders.
May the force be with you.
Always.
Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @HeadToHeadSW. Submit your questions for our next show. Visit our official website at headtoheadswpodcast.com. Until next time, may the force be with you, always.